Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Abed, and I'm the head of the Social Science Department here at Grand Rapids Community College, and I would like to take a moment and welcome you all to our 4th annual Race and Ethnicity Symposium. One of the things that I'm going to do is a little bit of housekeeping. On your way in, you should have received a form, a white piece of paper that's an assessment form for our conference so that we can get an idea of what people got out of it, what they liked, what they may not have liked, and other ideas for the future. Also, there's a flyer, a brochure actually, on the front at the table, why geography is important. So if you did not get one of those, there's plenty of them out there. We can make sure you get one before you leave. So again, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to one of my colleagues who's going to introduce our kickoff speaker for this evening, and that is Professor Mike DeVivo from the Geography Department.
Oh, geography lives, amen? Oh, come on, we could do better than that, huh? Anyway, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Marie Price from George Washington University speak here today. This is the second time that we've had a geographer speaking at our Race and Ethnicity Conference, and that has been because we have the only community college International Geographical Honor Society chapter in existence here that has provided some funding for this. So let's thank the International Geographical Honor Society. Thank you. Also, the Department of Geography and Planning at Grand Valley State University has been kind enough to support us as well. Can we have a round of applause for the Department of Geography at GVSU? And we're not done yet, okay? Pearson Education Publishing, Prentice Hall. How many of you are in the World Regional Geography class out there? Okay, a bunch of sinners, I see that. Okay, that's good. Because Dr. Price is one of the authors of your textbook, Pearson Education Publishing has also provided some support for this, as well as the Social Sciences Department of Grand Rapids Community College and other parts of the college itself. This conference is really important because it does provide us with various facets of race and ethnicity, not only across the country, but across the globe. And without going through the regular resume of Dr. Price, let me just say that when I am looking at speakers to come and deliver a message before you, I'm not really interested in one's academic pedigree, though Dr. Price hails from Syracuse, which is where our last speaker came from, Syracuse University. She has a great publication record, having engaged in writing some manuscript for the Journal of Historical Geography and a number of other publications, as well as this recent book, Migrants to the Metropolis. But that isn't what impresses me about Marie Price. There are a couple of important things. One is she has, like Leon Yatcher had last year, developed a reputation for sound teaching and geographic education. She has a teaching award on her vita, which is very important. But what's also important is her record of field work. Several years ago, the Geographical Review, a journal of the American Geographical Society, put out an issue devoted to fieldwork in geography, in which Marie was invited to comment on her notion of fieldwork and the importance of fieldwork in geography. People wonder, what is it that a geographer does anyway, To get a degree in geography, what do you have to do? Discover a country or something? I don't know. Memorize all the capitals, do really well at cocktail parties with all this trivia? I don't know what you have to do, people think. But really, it's field work. Being able to go out onto the landscape and understand the why of where. Be able to develop relationships with people and places and be able to make some sense out of it. Marie has done that. in sub-Saharan Africa. She's done that in Latin America, particularly with regard to Venezuela, and also with regard to some of the Latino communities in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. It is this record of field work that is very important because it enables us to make sense out of what is going on in the world. So we are very fortunate to have Marie Price to speak to us today. So please give her your attention. Thank you. Marie?
Thank you, Mike. That was, oh, I don't think I need this now, right? Put this down. Can you hear me? Good. Now you can really hear me. I can hear me. Well, it's thrilling to be here. This is my first time in Grand Rapids. And of course, as a geographer, I was picked up at the airport and I asked Mike, so, you know, why is Grand Rapids here? And he gave me the whole scoop about, you know, the river and furniture manufacturing. And I'm feeling like I've been debriefed slightly, but I need to learn more. I've not spent a lot of time in Michigan, but I have spent a lot of time throughout other states in the U.S. and of course, traveled quite a bit in the world. And one of the things that interests me as a geographer is trying to understand how global processes play out differently in different settings. I really reject the idea that the world is becoming homogenized because if you actually go to places in the world, you realize they are indeed quite different. And what inspired this talk and also the work that it's based on is an observation that there's growing interest in the question of globalization and what does globalization mean. And my understanding that one of the ways that we globalize is increased circulation of ideas, technology, capital, and also people. And then trying to understand, well, where are the people in the world going? How many migrants are there? There's a book by Castles and Miller, it's now in its 4th edition, called The Age of Migration, and it talks about how important immigration and movement of people across national borders has been, not just for the United States and Canada, but now really for all over the world. And what does it mean? What is the outcomes? They would say that no longer can we really talk about sending and receiving countries, that many states both send and receive immigrants. But then as I delved a little more deeply into the topic, I became aware that the distribution of immigrants is never even. It's very spiky. Some places get a lot more immigrants than others, and they get them from different countries, and so the mix becomes very important. And that really one of the major places where immigrants are going today and all over the world are the global cities, really big cities. Not every big city, but a lot of them. And so what motivates us is looking at how major urban centers have experienced and dealt with increased diversity in their populations, and what have the consequences been in terms of landscape, in terms of culture, in terms of political conflict, economic growth, decline. And so this is going to be kind of a brief survey of some of my findings based on long-term work, and then sharing with you some of the results in a website that you could, if you want to look it up later. These are images from 3 different cities that I've written about. The photo on the right is Amsterdam, which is a very diverse population, has long been a major destination for immigrants. One of the largest groups are Moroccans and Surinamese, but they've got just about everybody there. The top photo is a shopping center outside of Washington, D.C. in Falls Church, Virginia. And if you're a real student of flags, everyone knows the flag on the left. But what's this flag on the right? Vietnam. But what Vietnam? It's the South Vietnamese flag. which doesn't fly in Vietnam anymore. And so this tells you something about the population here, a refugee population that came in the 70s and 80s. And then the lower right photo is Dubai, which is kind of one of the most amazing immigrant cities I've ever been to. 80% of the population, actually it's 83% of the city's population is immigrants. You have to work hard to find Emiratis under those circumstances. And this is the largest building in the world, which just opened and then closed again. It was called then the Burj Dubai. It has a new name now. And the labor that built it was largely Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Indian. So let's move ahead. So the UN actually pays a lot of attention to immigration figures, particularly at the country level. They don't really break it down as much at the metropolitan level. But if you look at this graph beginning in 1960 to 2005, and they actually now, I think they have a 2010 estimate, roughly sometime in the 1990s, we hit this mark where about 3% of the world's population are immigrants. What does immigrant mean? In this case, it means somebody has left their country of birth and are residing for a period of more than a year in another country, and then they get counted in that process. It's tricky. The numbers are always soft. Probably they represent the floor, not the ceiling, in terms of the number of people that are moving internationally and staying for a period of time. But you look at this and say 3% of how many billion are we? 5, 6, something. Not much. What's the big deal? Anyone can handle 3%. And that doesn't sound like much. So it means that the vast majority of people do not emigrate. They stay in their country of birth. They may move within their country, but it doesn't involve many people. But then you look at the absolute numbers, and you go from a figure of, say, 80 million to, say, 200 million. And 200 million, that actually sounds like a lot of people. You know, that gets significant. And so here you get into this idea, and when immigration, people talk about immigration, if you want to get people alarmed that there's a lot of immigration, you say there are 200 million people roaming the planet and taking your jobs or something, and that will rile people up. But if you say we're talking about 3% of the world's population, you think, who doesn't matter. But it's because immigration is so uneven, it's so geographical, it's so spatial. That's why I wanted to look at some of these patterns and flows. So here's another way to look at it. Again, based on UN data, that show that what countries, the percentage of their population that are immigrants. And no surprise here, the UAE jumps out at #1. In fact, a number of Gulf states are in here. These would be oil-producing countries. They bring in a lot of foreign labor, almost always on contract or temporary situations, although you can be a temporary worker for 25 years, which begs the question, what does temporary really mean? But 71% of their population in 2005 was foreign-born. Then Kuwait, Singapore, also very high. Again, it's a city-state. Israel, it's unique history because they have a policy of resettlement if you actually can prove your Jewish ancestry, you are given a place as Israeli citizen. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Oman. The first time you get to a European country, it's Switzerland. Then Australia, a classic country of immigration. Latvia really surprises people, and that's also because of the breaking up of the Soviet Union, and people that were born outside of Latvia but were residing there, say were Russian, were now counted as foreign-born. Canada at 20%. And actually, what's kind of striking is that the US is not on this list. So that means that the population that are foreign-born in the US has got to be less than 14%. What is the population of foreign-born in the United States? Any guesses? 8? Good guess. A little more than that, probably 12, 13%. So it would be close. We got to the next one. But a lot of times, that said, if you were going to pick one country that had the most foreign-born, in terms of absolute numbers, it would be the US. Okay, so again, relative and absolute population. The U.S. is a big country, 300 million people, and probably closing in on about 40 million immigrants. So again, another way to think about migration and flows is something that the UN keeps track of called rates of net migration, where they basically, per every 1,000 people in the population on an annual basis, are you gaining or losing people? And these numbers are very low. It shouldn't be percentage. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4. So Canada actually has a rate of net migration of 6 per 1,000 people, which is considered quite high. And Canada is actually a much higher proportion of its population is immigrant. The United States has a rate of 4. Other countries here, South Africa, Brazil, South Africa slightly positive, Brazil slightly negative. And then you have countries that have very high rates of negative net migration. Here are the Philippines, Pakistan, and Mexico that have a real history and tradition of people leaving and to work overseas. Filipinos actually work lots of different places. They have they actually have a government policy, a goal to export 1 million people a year. Kind of an interesting goal for a state to have, but and where Filipinos go are often nursing, domestic care, and also seafarers. And then Mexico, the bulk of the immigrants that leave Mexico are headed mostly to the U.S. and some to Canada and a few other places, but predominantly the United States. So back in seems like a long time ago, 2004, 2005, I was working with my colleague Lisa Benton Short, and we thought, now, what are the big cities of the world that have a lot of immigrants? And we thought this question could be very easily answered, maybe in a few hours on Google, or if not, go to the International Census Library. And it turns out that nobody had ever pulled that data together on the urban scale. So we ended up diving into about 50 different censuses and having foreign students help us translate them. And we came up with our list of, these are 19 cities, although I'd probably add Madrid now. So these are cities that are big metropolitan areas, 1 million or more in size, that have over 1 million foreign-born in them. Okay, and on one level, you could say, well, it's a pretty global pattern, but there's no country in South America or Africa that will meet that description. You've got a couple Australian cities, a couple in East Asia, 3 in the Gulf, in Europe, Paris, London, Moscow, and then the US and Toronto in Canada would all make that benchmark. And 1 million foreign-born is pretty substantial, although, again, some of these metropolitan areas are quite big. The old definitions, say, of Los Angeles and New York were, in 2000, 9 million people, although they changed the boundaries and the numbers have really changed too. But nevertheless, this is an interesting map, and it shows that there are not just traditional immigration countries, US, Canada, Australia, but other places in Europe, Russia, and certainly the Gulf that have become really important immigrant destinations. And then when you step back and look at this in the global picture, in these cities, there were 35 million foreign-born. And in terms of immigration, New York is still the Big Apple. It has more immigrants than any other city, somewhere on the order of about 5 million. But that equals to about the 18.5% of the foreign-born estimates for the world. So you look at these 19 cities, and you account for almost 1 in 5 of all the world's immigrants. So when I say that immigration is very spiky, yeah, there are immigrants everywhere, but there are a few places where there are huge numbers of them. And what are the factors that make that possible? Both policies on the ground in cities, immigrant networks, industries, labor demand, all sorts of things. But then 1 million is kind of a catchy threshold. We also did mapping of cities that had over 100,000 immigrants, 250,000 immigrants, and 1 million immigrants. And then actually you get Europe pops out with a lot more cities. And today, again, there's always a lag in the immigration data. But if you look at regional terms, Europe today has more immigrants than North America. And that's because of changes in the EU that allow for the free movement of labor across the EU boundaries. There's been much more movement within Europe in terms of labor migration and people residing and working in countries other than their countries of birth. But North America is still very impressive, no surprise. The Middle East, places like Tel Aviv or Amman, and of course Mecca and Medina, Jeddah are important destinations. And then even a couple African and South American cities come up when you get at least lower numbers. In years past, Buenos Aires would have been at the 1 million city, but actually as Argentina's economy declined in the last 10 or 15 years, so did its immigrants. And actually, Argentines left, so it isn't quite at that million threshold, although it may rebound. It's definitely an important immigrant city. So again, this is sort of trying to capture that spatial pattern, the unevenness, and also to try and understand, well, now that we have this pattern, what are the processes and what happens on the ground in these places? And so this book, Migrants to the Metropolis, that I published, we profiled 12 different cities, and here are some of them, from Toronto to Dublin to Seoul, Korea, Washington, D.C. And actually, before I finish up, one of the points of this graph is that even countries that have very high rates of emigration, say Australia is definitely a country of immigrants, and maybe 22% of the population is foreign-born. But when you go to Sydney, you get a number closer to 30%. And so that, again, the difference in scale when you're looking at national figures versus urban figures. And again, there's immigrants go to rural places as well, but there's definitely a preponderance of immigrants in urban areas, and the percentages are often much higher than the national figures. So here are some of the themes that I'm going to throw out from looking at all these different cities. And the first thing that's really fascinating is this notion of hyper-diverse cities. We tend, in the migration literature of the United States, to call America a melting pot, and certainly the literature in the late 19th, early 20th century writing about that other great period of immigration. But when you think about it, most of the immigrants then were from where? They're from Europe, right? There were some Asian immigrants, a few from the Americas, but it was very much a European flow, a diverse European flow, but nevertheless European. So this is a pie chart. I love these pie charts in color. They're even better, of the city of Toronto. Has anyone ever been to Toronto? Great city, right? Maybe everyone seems to be well-behaved and well-mannered, and yet incredibly diverse. Half of the population, almost half, is foreign-born. And this is the pie chart of the, well, 44%, I exaggerated a little bit. 2 million people. And, you know, the #1 country is China, India, the UK, Italy, Philippines, Jamaica, Portugal, Poland, Sri Lanka. We're at the halfway mark. Guyana, former USSR. It's one of those cities that, you know, you can hear Bulgarian in the streets, you know, if you know what Bulgarian sounds like. Or there's a little bit of everything there. And Canada has really played up this idea of its multiculturalism and diversity. But when you think about it in the course of human history, how many places have there been that have existed like this, with people literally from all over the world? I mean, yes, you could say the Roman Empire was cosmopolitan, or Samarkand, or pick your historic city, but today there are 20, 30, maybe even more really big cities that have incredible diversity like this. I would argue that Toronto is actually more diverse than New York in many measures, but New York has more immigrants. So not every city is hyper-diverse, and I'm going to show that, but that's a pattern, and hyper-diversity can create tensions and also real benefits. Some people look at it imbues a more creative group of people that share ideas, and then also people say real intense diversity like that and sudden change can result in xenophobia and the native population feeling threatened by the change. The second thing in looking at these cities is because they're very big and have huge numbers of foreign born, they're also places of contestation and protest. And certainly we saw in 2006, especially, lots of protests in the United States in surprising cities. You know, Milwaukee had people protesting for immigration reform. These were not violent protests, but they were significant. You know, in the case of Los Angeles, they estimated that close to 1 million people took to the streets. Not terribly surprising, given how large the immigrant population is in Los Angeles. But that cities become the place where groups mobilize and try to stake claim to whether it's access to citizenship or regularization or recognition. And then in the case of the riots in Paris in 2005, which got a lot of press, that wasn't necessarily about immigration, because some of the people that were involved in the riots weren't immigrants per se, but it was very much from the North African community in Paris, the Muslim community, who maybe were second generation or third generation, but had felt that they had been excluded from the dominant society or had been marginalized, and that led to, there was a police incident that had a reaction and led to widespread protests. And so it's oftentimes in dealing with race and place, when you add in the mix of immigration and the tensions of very different populations getting together, it can erupt in cities. One of the places where it's gotten incredibly tense in the last few years is Johannesburg. And one of the tensions here is that South Africa is one of the wealthiest state in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's some very poor neighbors and very troubled neighbors in Zimbabwe and historically Mozambique. And so a lot of immigrants, refugees have come to South Africa, but not just from the surrounding countries, but also from West Africa and East Africa, skilled migrants. But there's been this tremendous backlash by native black South Africans who've said, wait a minute, we need our lives to get better before we take care of other people in sub-Saharan Africa. And so there's been enormous tensions of picking, you know, certain immigrant groups, you know, selective beatings and killings, because the feelings are these people are not welcome. You know, we have our own problems. And it isn't along racial lines, because it's largely among a black African population, but it's very clearly along ethnic lines and sometimes different linguistic lines. So that these issues that for a long time we thought, oh, this is only issues that happen, say, in developed countries that receive immigrants, are actually happening in lots of other places as well. So one of the things that I'm interested in my work in the U.S. is how, and other places, how national immigration policies affect places and cities. And this is a graphic, you've probably seen some variation of it before, showing the pattern of immigration to the United States starting in 1800 and going to 2000. And so the last period of great migration, say from the 1880s to 19-teens, it was substantial. And we just reached a similar peak in terms of absolute numbers around 2000. But it was a very different composition. And so what this map is showing you is that almost all of this flow is either Southern or Eastern European or Northern European. And then there were actually dramatic changes in the world economy. And there were also political changes. Very severe restrictions on immigration were imposed. Actually, beginning in the 1880s, there was actually an Asian Exclusion Act that forbid Asians to immigrate to the United States. They drew a map later. They drew a line on the map of the world, said people from this part of the world can't come here. And then to basically World War, Depression, everything really dropping off, so that by the 1940s, 50s, the number of immigrants coming in had really declined, and their percentage of the population had steadily declined. Then 1965 comes along, and that's a seminal year for immigration because there was a major immigration reform act, and basically it eliminated quotas and very much opened the door so that people from other parts of the world could come to America. And as you see, the composition really changed pretty dramatically, so that the peak, what the color coding of 100 years ago is very different today, where much more, still there are Europeans in the mix, but many more from Latin America, Asia, and actually Africa. Pretty interesting dynamic flows from sub-Saharan Africa. So that might be the national picture, but locally it plays out very differently, and I'm comparing here, this seems like so long ago, 2000, but for the reasons of the census, it's not a bad comparison. When comparing these two cities and what they called the metropolitan area then, they were about the same size. They actually had similar numbers of foreign-born. LA in this case is a little bit higher, but the boundaries of New York have since been changed. But Los Angeles is diverse, yes, but overwhelmingly Mexican. And that's no surprise. If you've ever been to Los Angeles, you know that. There's lots of Mexicans there, and Salvadorans. If you take those two, that's half of the population of foreign-born. Whereas New York's quite different. Dominicans, the largest group, there's only 12%, then China, then Jamaica, then Mexico, which is kind of a new arrival to New York, Guyana, Ecuador, Haiti, Colombia, Italy. There's a European country. So again, different composition. And for both of these cities, you could probably find someone from every country in the world, but that's the general pattern. So even though we have immigration reform in 1965 that opens up the doors, different streams form, and certain ethnic groups are drawn to particular cities or even particular places within cities, and that whole phenomenon of rich literature of enclave formation and social networks is a fascinating literature that is very relevant to the US urban experience, but it's also relevant to most other urban areas that receive immigrants. Now, I put this map up because when this is map not of immigration but of race, and in the United States, racial categories are constructed and people agree upon them or don't agree upon them. But what this map is at the county level. And while most counties in America, although not all, are majority white, the map here is showing what is the largest racial minority group in a particular county, excluding white. What would be the next group? And so you've got a lot of green here and a lot of purple here. And what are we mapping? This is showing the green here are Hispanic or Latino. So this is an ethnic category, but also gets used, some would say inappropriately, as a racial category. And this probably doesn't surprise you, right? You know, the history of immigration, especially from Mexico and Central America, the Southwest. If you were going to pick the likelihood of your dominant ethnic group to be Hispanic, you're more likely to see that in the West. Although there have been some interesting changes. And actually, Michigan is quite diverse if you look at that. You've got areas where the dominant minority group is African American, other counties where it's Hispanic, others where there's two or more races, there's no obvious one, and then a couple that yellow is Native American. Okay. Then the purple shows the historic area where African Americans has settled. But there are some interesting areas, particularly like northern Georgia, North Carolina, where really pretty new Hispanic immigration has come in and changed some of the ethnic and racial composition. And then the yellow shows up in some of those less popular western states where Native American some of the reservation lands are. Again, this isn't proportional for population, it's just showing the counties, but kind of an interesting way of looking at it. The two outliers, Alaska, no surprise, jumps out where the minority group of largest size is Native American, and then Hawaii, it's Asian. The blue is showing where Asian groups are the leading minority group, and it's not that many places. It's big cities like a Seattle or San Francisco, and then a sort of smattering of university towns, I think, and some cities. All right. One of the things that interests me very much, and from both a human rights perspective and a policy perspective, is how in many countries of immigration today have these expanding categories of entry. And if anyone has ever been through what is called, affectionately called ICE, which is a great acronym for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they're the people you go through for now in Homeland Security. They have an alphabet soup of visa categories. You know, they go from A, B, C, G, double X. I mean, and there are all sorts of ways people come in for different reasons. And even though we say in the United States we don't really have a temporary worker program, we actually really do have several temporary worker programs, from agricultural workers to high-tech workers. But in some states and countries, this is a game that a lot of places are playing right now. And right now it seems the holy grail in immigration policy is to find those very skilled, very mobile, high-tech workers and bring them to your country or city and rev up your economy. And so those people are highly sought after, and they get sort of special visas. But then in a lot of industrialized or post-industrialized economies where men work and women work and there's no one to take care of very old parents or very young children, you also need domestic labor and you need elder care. And so where is that labor going to come from? And typically, increasingly, we're looking to other parts of the world to provide that labor, some of it through legal means, some of it through illegal, undocumented means. So this is a shot taken in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is a very densely settled place. Most of the immigrants in Hong Kong, it has a very large immigrant population, are from mainland China. And you might say, well, wait a minute, you know, isn't Hong Kong part of China? And yes and no. Officially, yes, it turned over to become part of China, but administratively, it's still treated quite differently. And so Hong Kong has its own immigration policy. And one of the striking things is that there is 500,000, 400,000 Filipina women who work in Hong Kong in elder care and child care. And if you're ever in Hong Kong on a Sunday, they gather in the financial district because that's shut down on Sunday. And it's really the only place they can gather because apartments are small, there's not a lot of space. And they just literally sit on the ground, underneath, on sidewalks, hundreds, thousands of them. That's their one place to gather and socialize and have some time on their own. And this is a very regular, controlled migration. People work for 6 months here. And these sorts of pattern of controlled labor migration are being erected all the time, lots of different places. And it's a way of guaranteeing labor, but not having future citizens. At least that's what it is in theory. It doesn't always work that way. And even there's this old saying, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary worker. That you think, oh, we'll just do a temp, but then you become reliant upon them. You keep extending their contracts, and lo and behold, someone's working in a place that's technically not their home for 20 years. The place that's most extreme in this regard is some of the Gulf states. And I got a chance in 2006 on my sabbatical to spend time in Dubai. On this trip, I went with my husband, who's a photojournalist, so he was taking pictures and I was doing interviews. And this is really standard worker housing. And to talk about a geography of segregation, you know, it's 80% of your population is foreign-born. But they almost all live in these hostels on the periphery of town. And then the accommodations are kind of crowded. And this would be one room of 6 men, another room, you know, all taking care of their own laundry and cooking, et cetera. And typically these men would come for 3 years. They would spend the first year paying off their debt, the cost of the contractor getting there, and maybe even some of the second year, and then hopefully midway through the second year or third year, make enough money, take it back home to where home was. In this case, these men were all from Bangladesh. So it's a calculation. I can make more money working here under harsh conditions, usually 6-7 days a week, 12-hour shifts, but I'll never make this money in Dhaka, so I'll come to Dubai. And there's whole recruitment that makes this possible. And this, it's interesting in a globalizing economy how the needs of labor are increasingly looking to bringing in workers under these conditions. On the plus side, it's legal and regulated, and their workers have rights. But on the negative side, they're not citizens. Any infraction, if some boss says, "I don't like the way you look," you're immediately deported. I mean, so it's a very kind of tenuous situation. And certainly, if you threaten to try and organize into unions, which a group did in 2007, all of them were deported immediately. So again, it's a pattern that we're seeing lots of different places. So when we think about immigration, there's usually the tendency, well, these are national policies. The countries make decisions on who's allowed in. And that's usually the case. But when you scale it down and look at where people settle, you pretty quickly discover that these localities, cities, suburbs, kind of become the de facto policymakers, because people don't move to a country per se, but they move to a place. They move to a Grand Rapids or a Boston or a Chicago. And then there has to be a way where the locality either integrates them or sometimes excludes them or isolates them. And so one of the ways of thinking about this, and I've done a lot of interviews with different government officials at the urban level, is what I call accommodation strategies. When a locality decides, okay, we've got some really interesting diversity here, and we have to accommodate it. So the first one is communications in multiple languages. And if you go to one of these very diverse cities, New York or Toronto or even Washington, you'll go to like the county web pages, and they'll have instructions on what to do during a snow emergency in 7 or 8 languages. You know, it'll be in Farsi, it'll be in French Creole, it'll be in Spanish, it'll be in Urdu, because they know this is a way people are going to get information. And then because a lot of immigration, at least to the US, is often family immigration, schools become a major central point for integrating and helping families assimilate. And so schools have had to come up with some really interesting strategies, like telephone translation services. Like you have a family that arrives from Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. Gosh, no one on your staff speaks Mongolian. What are you going to do to explain to a mom and dad that your son or daughter needs to be at school on these days? They have these telephone translation services that you call up, and they pay a fee for very unusual language translation. Some communities really try to view their diversity as an asset and celebrate it. I've been in communication. My new pen pal is the mayor of Strasbourg, who says he has the best integration diversity program anywhere in Germany, if not the world. And he says, we love immigrants, bring them on, you know. And he was a very engaging fellow. But he says, but we don't let them live together. We have to spread them out. I go, well, maybe they might want to live together. He goes, oh, that's not good. You know, you got to sprinkle them around the city. So, you know, interesting how ways that cities manage. Or in this image here, which is not a particularly exciting picture, this was an immigrant native housing project in Vienna called Global Yard, where there are very strict guidelines. The population in this housing project, which there's a lot of public housing in Vienna. It's something like half the city lives in public housing. it had to be half native-born and half foreign-born. And they felt that if native-born and foreign lived together, shared the same elevators and went to the same schools, that they would break down barriers. And so these are all ways in which local communities try to accommodate and integrate. And I think integration always happens at the local level. It's really hard to You can set national policies or laws, but how it plays out locally is really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. And then there's all sorts of interesting ways where communities push people away, the deflecting of immigrants. And a lot of these are sort of quickly bar on being considered unconstitutional. One really interesting episode in Northern Virginia, Manassas, they were very unhappy with their Hispanic population had grown very quickly, and they were concerned there was overcrowding. And a lot of immigrant families, if you have limited means, put a lot of people in a house. You might have 8, 10 people living in a home. So the Manassas city passed an ordinance that it was against the law to sleep in your living room. Why would you pass a law like that? Well, the rationale meaning is that then, if somebody called up and said there's people sleeping in their living room, that would mean there are too many people in the house. And it was a stupid law, totally ill-conceived, and quickly, because what happens? How many of you have slept in your living room? You're watching the Olympics, you fall asleep, something happened. Not really what you want to do. And they determined that's not the way. But there are oftentimes laws that set occupancy limits, which have sound reasons for them. So avoiding fire codes. But the way these laws when they get imposed, and then the certain people that are targeted for these laws can quickly become very racialized, and looking at newcomers in particular. One of the areas that, at least especially in the U.S., that gets a lot of attention are day labor centers, when people wait on a street corner for work and get picked up. And there's some communities that want to get rid of them, some that want to formalize them, but they become very, very contentious. But then the last example that's really taken off is a federal program called the 287G program, where for the first time, local law enforcement officers can be authorized after training to detain people they suspect as being illegal. And these are a number of counties, cities, and actually a couple entire states have signed up for these 287Gs. I didn't bring my map of that for the U.S. But this quickly can become a way where immigrants perceive this as a way of if a town says, we have a 287G, and if you're, in this case, Hispanic or have an accent, if you're pulled over for a traffic violation, you're the person that's likely to be asked, where are your papers, and do you have your right papers, and these sorts of things. And these are still practiced. The numbers of 287Gs are actually growing, and it's actually a program that Homeland Security has been encouraging because there's just not enough federal agents. But it really changes the games. I interviewed a sheriff in Prince William County about 2 years ago, and I said, what would happen, let's just say, if the Congress passed a law and all the so-called undocumented or illegal population became legal, an amnesty? And he said, oh, ma'am, my job would be so much easier, because you have to police, but if people are afraid of you, it's really hard to police. And it's a very interesting dynamic. And it's all premised on who belongs and who doesn't. What is legal, what is illegal. Some people think it's really black and white, but when you start digging into it, it gets pretty complicated. One of the reasons why these big immigrant destinations are so important is that immigrant labor is fundamental for the economy, from very high-skilled labor. I don't know how many of you have ever been to the Silicon Valley, but I grew up in California, and my family lives there, and I had the really eye-opening experience. One day I went to a software company to meet my brother for lunch. This was 15 years ago, and I walked into the dining room, and 70% of the people were South Asian. I had no idea. You know, and they said, "Oh yeah, don't you know that? We run on Indian technical labor." You know, and you know, now maybe that's well known, but I don't think it was so well known 15 years ago. So bringing in highly skilled labor, but also lesser skilled labor from, you know, day laborers and construction and domestic work, and how these different labor niches are filled, sometimes with particular groups from different countries filling them, is a real part of the how urban economies work. Then on the kind of cultural landscape side, it's pretty amazing how new spaces get created in cities, particularly when you get concentrations of people. So these are just some neighborhood shots, whoops, but I kind of like the Seoul Plaza, which isn't in Seoul. It's in actually Northern Virginia. And incidentally, it's not just Korean businesses, but there's like an Armenian bakery and a couple other places that you probably wouldn't find in a Seoul Plaza. And then this earlier picture of a Vietnamese shopping center that I showed earlier. And often when talking about race and ethnicity in city spaces, it's pretty easy to start thinking about how people are sorted out. And in the immigrant literature, there's a lot of discussion about immigrants self-selecting to live amongst themselves, the advantages and strategies for that. And then other cases being forced to live in places because of resettlement policies if you're a refugee or you know, economics. And so here are two examples. One city, Dublin, which now has about 12% of its population foreign-born, which is pretty extraordinary because 25 years ago it was about 1%. It was an incredibly homogeneous city and now has become much more diverse. And here you get, this is a map that actually took a lot of work to get the data to make, just showing how some areas of the city have anywhere from 27 to 50% immigrant, and then others almost no immigrant population. And so this isn't surprising. You're getting clustering for lots of different reasons because of transportation, housing costs, self-selection, and maybe even resettlement policies. And this is another picture in Amsterdam. This is one of the most diverse regions of city areas of Amsterdam called the Balmer. And what's interesting here is this housing stock was all built kind of in the 60s, and there were apartment housing that was really built for the Dutch, but it was at around the time where the Dutch decided they didn't like that kind of housing anymore, so it was very lightly settled. And then as immigrants started coming in the 60s and 70s, they were drawn to this, and now this area of high-rises is almost, in some areas, 85% foreign-born, pretty dramatic. But there are places in cities, it's easy and kind of unavoidable when you're a geographer to sort of map clusters and concentrations. But I've also tried to find ways of mapping places that are really diverse, that have incredible mixes of people as the sort of places that might be these hyperdiverse nodes that lead to maybe more tolerance and understanding. And so this is another area in Amsterdam, and this is actually a group, a Bolivian group at an international festival where I've been doing some work in Washington. And then I'm just showing these two maps. I'm almost done. This is the District of Columbia, and I also masked out Arlington and Alexandria as kind of the urban core. And then the rest are the suburbs, and the suburbs in Washington include Virginia and Maryland. And one of the interesting things is that in 1980, and these are mapping basically neighborhoods, I'm using zip codes, there were 20 years or 30 years ago, there were a few places that had up to 9% of their population foreign-born, and some maybe 10 to 19% foreign-born. And then by 2000, and Washington received an enormous number of immigrants in the last 30 years, but especially the 1990s, there was incredible growth. These are all suburbs, and most of the immigrants in Washington actually live in the suburbs. They're not so much in the district. And you have these outside the Beltway neighborhoods, these are the famous Beltway of Washington, very suburban, that are 30 and 40% immigrant. So this is a really radical change, and we've done studies of places that were, in 1970, 98% say white, then they kind of go maybe white to more black, and then black to more Hispanic, these really interesting racial changes. And then some places like Wheaton that maintain incredible diversity. And one of the policy issues at locally, what is it? Are certain jurisdictions better able to accommodate diversity, or others trying to push people out? And that's sort of getting into the weeds, but I think there's a lot of interesting issues going on here. And then the last 2 points I wanted to end with is how, when you have very large flows of people from different countries that speak different language and maybe have different religions, or how does it change your sense of citizenship or belonging? And it becomes even more critical when you start having these large populations that are considered undocumented, illegal, or part-time, or guest workers. How do they fit into the narrative of your state? And certainly in the 2006 and 2007, when immigration reform was almost twice on the verge of something happening but then not happening, these questions about identity and belonging were coming up all the time. Interestingly, this picture is of Tel Aviv, and one of the curious things about the Israel immigration story is that there's a lot of immigrants. They all mostly are Jewish, but increasingly they're also bringing in labor from other countries, in this case guest workers from the Philippines. And even though Israel had a very unique immigrant history, it's actually changing to, in some ways, looking more and more like other major immigrant destinations because of certain demands for labor. And then the last point I want to make is that when we think about these places that draw in large numbers of immigrants, it's a very dynamic process. It changes with cycles, maybe the global economy. But there are very few places that start as a gateway and stay as a gateway. They decline, ebb and decline. And so actually I was thinking about Detroit in this regard. Detroit was a major immigrant destination, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then even in the 20s, 30s, a lot of internal migration that changed the composition of Detroit. And then, of course, now it's very much a story of decline, losing population, and the reworking of a post-industrial economy where the sort of economic might and power of Detroit is really challenged. And I think it's important to understand how these gateway cities form. We're in a very dynamic period of a lot of movement and a lot of mobility and a lot of global capital and global immigration flows. But there can be shocks to the system that really change that and redirect populations. Anti-immigrant policies at the national level, or a major, this economic recession, however it plays out, if it deepens, that could really change immigration policy. So I'm going to end here with testing your Michigan knowledge. And okay. You all know the term ancestry, right? It's one of the few questions that you'll get to answer when you fill out your census form when it comes to you or it comes to your parents. And so ancestry, you can have multiple answers. But basically, someone be brave. When I say, what is your ancestry? What will some of you say? What would you check on the box?
Italian.
Italian. Mike?
Absolutely.
What do you think most people in Michigan say when they check ancestry? No, it's not a race question. It's ancestry. Dutch? I hear Dutch. What else? Polish? German. Ding, 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 ding. There are 12.4 million ancestors. There are only about 10 million people in Michigan, but you can check multiple ancestries, and clearly some people do. But German was number one. 2.3 million Michigonians. Is that how you say it? Sorry, Michiganders. I'm humiliated. Say German. Then what do they say? Irish. And then we get the English. Where are the Italians? No, the Poles. And then about 500,000 French, Dutch, Italian, and then American. And that's actually kind of interesting. People never used to fill in American. Actually, as people started filling in, I'm American. And it's still a pretty low-ranking category, although there's some places, particularly Appalachia, for some reason, they check American almost every time. That's like the, and again, it's an ancestry question. So it's saying, where do your peoples come from way back? And some people say, they've always been here, and so ancestry. And if you were going to make a generalization, ancestry is a story, the history of immigration, right? You wouldn't have people saying they were Polish unless somebody came from Poland, or somebody came from Ireland, or somebody came from Germany, right? So, and most of these are European, right? So, ding, 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 foreign born in Michigan. Now, Michigan's kind of interesting. About 6% of your population is foreign born. And this is the ACS 2006 08. So that's a little lower than national average. The national average is 12.5%. What's your top country of foreign born in Michigan? Croatia, Canada. It's Mexico, right? It's not a very big number, 85,000, but it's a pretty large proportion. I mean, you actually have people from everywhere in Michigan. It's pretty, it's a big state, and you've had a lot of refugee resettlement, et cetera, but you look just like the rest of America, that Mexico's your biggest group. Mexico's the biggest group of immigrants, and in most countries, the states, they're the leading one. Then comes India. How many of you would have guessed India? And that's a real direct relationship to H-1B visas, high-tech visas, and then people converting and getting regular, getting their citizenship or legal permanent residence. Pretty important number. Who do you think's next? I heard Croatia. An Asian country? Give me one. China would be a good guess. Canada! You actually do pretty well in drawing in the Canadians, And then comes Iraq. But that's really, I think, more of a Detroit story. There's a very large Arab population. But I would say there are not many states in the U.S. where Iraq is the fourth most common immigrant. That could change. But right now, that's definitely a unique feature. Then China. And who else do I have? And then kind of tied at the 20,000 mark, Lebanon, Korea, and by golly, the Germans got in there. Not many, not compared to all that claim ancestry, but certainly there are some Germans still born in Germany residing here. So to sum up, I've gone on too long. The point of this talk is to try and think about immigration as it is a global phenomenon. We're in this age of immigration, but it's a very uneven pattern. And some places have been more greatly impacted than others, and particularly cities, and particularly some cities. But I also think looking at these places that have formed with really diverse really speaks to the dynamism of globalization, both the really positive sides and also some of the negative sides. And with that, I finish. You're looking for them.
We have the little.
There's some mics.
You got the mic?
We can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay. But I guess you want to record this, huh? All right. Thank you very much for a very dynamic and informative lecture. Right now, I would like to take questions from individuals in the audience, and also note that you have some cards, some index cards that were passed out to you. Perhaps you could write questions on them, and we will go ahead and deliberate over them. Any questions so far? Go ahead. You go.
Hi, my name is Gordon Vurcic. I'm one of the foreign-born citizens of Michigan. I would like to challenge you a little bit on this notion of diversity with which you started your talk. I think, if I correctly remember, that in your talk, or perhaps in your work in general, you'd like to challenge this thesis that the world is becoming the same everywhere, right? I think this thesis has been advanced, like the world is becoming the same in the sense the world is becoming like the West, right? That's what I meant. That's, I think, that proponents of globalization in academic circles mean, right? But aren't they right in the other way? If the whole world is becoming diverse, isn't that at the same time becoming the same?
Well, I mean, but it might be diverse, but it's different mixes of people settled in different places, and there are some places that aren't diverse at all. Some of the big global cities that Tokyo, for example, although it's becoming more diverse, it's not very diverse, but it's a major center of capital and investment and trade. Seoul is another example, and fill in some of the, well, I guess Shanghai, they have a larger immigrant population that's really counted, and China doesn't make its data available. But I do think the McWorld thesis that's out there that we're all going to be eating McDonald's and I don't know, singing "We Are the World" or something. I just don't see that. Yeah, there's similarities, but I think in place, people take what they want from popular culture and they modify it. They make it their own. And so, it's the interconnectedness allows for more familiarity and maybe less outright hostility. But to say place it's all like, that's just not empirically true from my experience. I don't know, maybe do you feel that if you go, I mean, my experience of if you go to a Dubai versus a Johannesburg, or yes, capital's there, yeah, but people, the way they think about themselves in the world, it's different.
I think some perhaps global companies have been operating under this conception of glocalization, right? That they modify it to local taste. So if you go to Croatia and eat McDonald's, you can drink beer and wine, right, in the McDonald's restaurant. So that's some local contribution to the
yeah, so I guess the flavor, is that accommodating or, but yeah, I mean, I guess I tend to side with that we have globalization and diversity rather than globalization and homogenization, but point well taken.
If you have a question, raise your hand and we get a microphone to you so that we can capture this on the videotape. I had a question, Dr. Price, right over here. I'm wondering, the people that are coming to these cities, these urban areas, are they emigrating from cities, or are they coming from rural areas in their native country?
It would be great if we knew that with certainty. You know, when people fill in the censuses, you just say what country you're from. Although there have been some really detailed studies, say the really famous work by Doug Massey and some of his sociologists called the Mexican Migration Project, which has literally tens of thousands of life histories. And they could say with real clarity where people are coming from. In the case of Mexicans to the United States, it's much more rural than urban, or secondary or tertiary cities. So it isn't so much people coming from Mexico City, but maybe a small urban center in Zacatecas, or a village even. But as much as we know about immigration, there's a lot we don't know. And what you get are these little snapshots, detailed studies of particular places. But there is that pattern throughout the developing world, and it's a pattern that happened in Europe and the U.S. earlier, where people would move from village to larger town to city. And rural-urban migration, what was it? I think they estimated right around the last 2 years, the population of the planet has now become half urban. Up until then, we'd always been more rural than urban, but now half of the people on planet Earth live in cities. So it'll become greater over time. So we are firmly an urban species now, and so in that dynamic of rural to urban, at least some of the work I've been doing in rural Bolivia, is that people used to go to La Paz, and they say, maybe if I'm going to go to La Paz, which is hard, and may as well go to Madrid. I'll make 5 times more money. And so it's very interesting to see this rural peoples making these very clear calculations. Why go to the capital if there's another capital I can go to? So it does happen, but I couldn't really generalize because we don't have the data to generalize. Although let me add one thing. When people talk about immigration today, and I gave the figure of 200 million immigrants in the world, basically China alone, they estimate there are 200 million people that have left rural areas to move to the coastal cities. And so some people say in terms of world migration, that's one of the biggest flows of all times. And so, mobility doesn't necessarily mean you're crossing boundaries, the state boundary, but for immigration scholars, it's crossing the state boundaries that matter.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. With your research, what exactly, how does this impact some of these policies that you've run across in some of these countries? I mean, I can see the benefit as a geographer. I can see the gaining of knowledge and putting this research down on paper. Mm-hmm. It's certainly important to know where people are and where everything's going. But have you ever come across where in a country, I guess what I'm trying to say is how does your research affect the policies that you're dealing with in these countries? Are you able to put your 2 cents in there and say, we need to do this, we need to do that, try to make it so that this immigrative population that's coming in from, let's say, a disaster, like in Haiti, happens and they have to move right away? I mean, are you able to use your research for that kind of tool, or is it just as simply a demographic, we need to know this kind of information? Well,
what inspired this was a need to know question. Empirically, I wanted to know where these things are. And so I put together this website, which is free to anybody. It's called Globalization, Urbanization, Migration, and you pick a country, and then once you get to the country, you get cities, and it has a lot of this urban data, some of it over multiple years. So if you wanted to know the flows of people to Dublin or Amsterdam or Johannesburg, it's there, and kind of fun. There's tables and maps and stuff, and I'm waiting really for another round of updating because a lot of censuses are being done the next couple of years, and then the data will come out. So part of that, but then in the policy side, where I think I've had a little influence is some of it is because I've done this comparative work. I was able to sit down with the ambassador of Bolivia and say, you're taxing remittances. That's a really bad idea. Your remittances are going to drop. And he said, well, thank you very much. And they continued taxing remittances. But at least, but he said, we've noticed they've been going down, And I said, yeah, duh. So talking to people. And then in one of the areas I think that really interests me in the long-term question in the U.S. of integration is what happens on the ground locally. And so then I've done some more policy level work looking at where are the places say that immigrants are more successful entrepreneurs and why? Is it just, people say, because the Chinese are good entrepreneurs? Maybe, but it also could be there are certain policies that reach out to small businesses or ethnic businesses that try and provide materials so that they can be better access to entrepreneurship and that sort of thing. So I think that in talking with people and pulling those stories together, that's helped me help get these, transfer the data into policy. Way in the back. I think you're a Michigander, but I can't tell.
Thanks. I was just wondering if the immigration that you talked about was mostly dealing with like jobs and things like that. If it was like any marriage, like people immigrate for marriage and things like that.
Some of it is just, I've got data on the foreign-born. I don't know how they got there. But a lot of this is labor migration, because those are likely to be people that get counted in censuses or, family reunification. And different countries have different policies that, the U.S. actually, although there are flaws, it's still a country that actually privileges the unification of nuclear families. It may take a while, but that's part of their policy. Other states do it differently and have more of a point system and only want skilled workers and maybe not their dependents. But what's not in here are generally like refugee flows. Those people don't always get counted in censuses. And then thinking about, there's all kind of work projecting under global climate change scenarios, how people are going to get displaced and what that means, and refugees as a result of drought, and I mean, eco-refugees, whatever. There's a lot of undercounting here. So the people you're most likely to count in these formal, and I'm dealing with government statistics, are legal or at least have been counted some way in a census. And so that tends to, it's not that they're undocumented people in these data too, but so it's definitely more capturing a labor migration flow than other flows. But there's a huge literature, the International Organization of Migration, which is a separate entity, though it works closely with the UN. They've been the last 10 years, 50 years, working intensely on the subject of human trafficking. And the numbers vary wildly. Some people say that there are several million people trafficked every year. Some estimates say 20, 50 million. I mean, they don't really know. But the trafficking is like, it's coercive, moving, and it can be internally within a state and overseas, from prostitution to illegally imprisoned workers. And so with that increased mobility and increased movement capital, and people always trying to find the better way to make a buck, that's how the sort of ingenuity of capital, there can be these real abuses. And the human rights communities are, and there's, UN charter signed, we don't, no country officially supports trafficking, but it happens, and a lot of times traffickers aren't really punished. And so that's a dark side. How that gets counted, no one really has good figures, but there's some pretty big numbers out there. And if you're interested in that, you could go to the IOM website, and they have lots of documents. Yes? You with the...
I had another question I was going to...
Sure. Sorry about that.
I was just going to ask, I'm in Mike DeVivo's World Regional Geography class, the greatest class ever created. And I was just curious, we've been looking at Sao Paulo, and like, we watched this video that I found it interesting that there was a man who was Japanese born, but he'd been living in Brazil, and he considered himself a Brazilian. And I guess I've always been kind of interested in that sense of as almost thinking of patriotism or nationalism as a semi possibly bad thing I just remember in school meeting a refugee of Bosnia or Croatia or whatever, thinking that these people fighting for their country, for their beliefs and everything, and that obviously that's a great thing. But if I guess that sense you touched on, that sense of identity, or what your thoughts are on, like, if someone moves to another place, if they should absorb into that culture more so as a way of obviously adapting, or if holding on to their cultural identity more so, or identifying themselves as wherever they were born, if that is a better way to go, or your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's a good or bad thing. I think we live in an age where people have nested identities. I mean, how many million people in the U.S. still check German as their ancestry? It's the biggest ancestry group. I forget the numbers. It's like 60 million. It's huge. And maybe these are people who have never been to Germany. Maybe the only German word they know is Wiener Schnitzel, and yet they have this sense of, I'm German, whatever that means. And that's okay, it's okay to have these identities, just to how you act upon them, right? The Japanese community in Brazil is fascinating, and I'll digress just for a minute. So when the US and Canada at the same time in the 1880s and 90s basically cut off Japanese labor to come to the US or Canada, and they were coming here. And so Brazil said, we'll take you. And so the largest population of ethnic Japanese in the world outside of Japan is in Brazil. And they're in Sao Paulo, and they're a very dynamic group. They've been entrepreneurs. They're good farmers, bankers. So in the 1980s, move up another 100 years. You know, this is third generation. Japan had this policy that said, if you're ethnic Japanese, you can come to Japan and live and work here. And the economy in Brazil was terrible, and so a couple 100,000 left. These were Brazilians, ethnically Japanese, and they went to Brazil. They went to Japan. They thought, we're Japanese, and they have been rejected. They've had a really hard time culturally because they might look Japanese, but they don't act Japanese. Like a Japanese person, it's a kind of a cliche. They don't come up and kiss you, you know. Brazilians kiss you. They throw their arms around you, you know. And so what was interesting, there's been this huge literature that's developed around the ethnic, and what the ethnic Japanese Brazilians are finding is all these years in Brazil, we thought of ourselves as Japanese. Now we go to Japan, a place most of them have never been to, and they realize, oh my God, we're Brazilian, you know? And so it speaks to the kind of complexity of identities, and that actually in moving to a different place, your whole sense of identity can be upended. And I think that's and actually there's a movement, ethnic Japanese in Japan to gain recognition. Anyhow, it's kind of an interesting story. And it speaks to how Sao Paulo was a major immigrant destination 100 years ago, and now it's a place where people are leaving. Oh, coming in. There was one other question?
I have one. Dr. Price, with your extensive travel, is there, in your estimation, a country or significantly large city that has been very proactive in terms of teacher preparation for preparing for the, let's say, the elementary and secondary experience you know, with such diversity amongst them? You know, is there anyone that moves that into a more proactive approach rather than responsive?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I know of individual teachers. It's a great way to teach geography, you know, when you've got very diverse students. But, you know, a lot of school districts have, you know, tried to make their readings and curriculum more multicultural. But, you know, I don't know the answer. Good question.
Would you care to comment on the value your research provides to the U.S. Military Special Operations Command? Just for a moment.
I told Mike, you know, he's a Marine. Did you know that? I was a Marine. And I said, oh, I went and spoke to this. I went and met with people at Special Operations who were interested in immigration. I thought, well, first of all, I thought, you don't really want to hear from me. I said, no, we do. And I guess what they were interested in is realizing, obviously, the nature of war has changed, and how do you think about people and places, and especially in the Middle East, where the U.S. is, in Central Asia, where they're thinking a lot, they realize that there's been so much fluidity in the populations, you know, understanding who's where, what, but also, I guess, the military likes maps and graphics. They like things laid out. And so I was able, in these graphics and some others, to show these sort of patterns of who's where, and not just, you know, you're fighting insurgents, you know, in Afghanistan or Iraq, but, you know, where else are there Iraqis in the world, and how that might play into as you think about intelligence and information. And so I provide this information to anyone. None of this is all open source data. There's nothing secret here. It just took the hours in the archives to pull it up, or in the databases, and to make it available, because I think it's important to realize how places are really changing through immigration. There was one more. He's patiently waited.
I'd just like a few more details on method. You mentioned going through the censuses and then going to different places and interviewing people, but I'd like a little bit more information about just the number crunching and the on-the-ground work.
Well, part of it, some censuses, one of the great resource I have in Washington is the U.S. Census has an international census library, and an exchange we have with almost all governments in the world is that they give us a copy of their census. And sometimes it's books, bounded books, and the Indian ones go on forever and ever and ever. And increasingly now it's CDs. And then more and more censuses are making their data available online. The hardest problem, believe it or not, was just coming up with the definitions of urban, what unit of measure we're talking with. And we were going for metropolitan areas, but there's inconsistency. The second hardest problem was coming up with a definition of foreign born. You think that would be consistent. It is not. I mean, it's very literal. You were born outside of the country that you now reside in. But for example, in the Netherlands, you're foreign born until the third generation. So if your parents immigrate, but you're born in Amsterdam, in the census, you're still counted as foreign born until you have children, you know. And it's just a way of thinking, you know. And some censuses actually don't make that data available at all. China, it's pretty hopeless. They don't, you know, there probably aren't a lot of foreign born, but you can't get it from the census. They don't ask that question. And then another work I've done trying to get it from the backside is look at some censuses, ours is not one of them, ask people, is there anyone in your household living in another country right now? So it's an immigration question. And that's actually, I'd love for us to have that question on our census, because I think there's a lot of Americans born here that are living lots of other places, and you know, we don't really have that. But so trying to, you're dealing sometimes with apples and oranges, come up with sort of consistent ways of dealing with each census, learning how the censuses are organized, because I dealt with 50 different country censuses. And then besides getting the raw numbers of where people are from, trying to figure out if we're dealing with first, second generation. Then I've constructed some diversity indexes, trying to measure what places are more diverse or not, and where people are coming from, looking at whether it's just neighbors coming or people from farther away. And then mapping has been a big part of my work. It's trying to get this data at a scale that allows you to say where people are settling, not just foreign-born, but different groups. But obviously I haven't done that for every city. And then in terms of my interviews and surveys, I've done a mixed techniques. I've done focus groups, I've done surveys, and then also some participant observation, going to festival or readings and meetings and that sort of thing. And a lot of that work has been in the Washington area because it's such a diverse immigrant population. There's a lot of hometown associations and groups that send monies and resources back. And so that's an interesting way of looking at the backflow. One of the things about immigration, we think of it as an arrow going one way, but there's always an arrow going back. So, Mexicans are the largest foreign-born population in the United States. What's the largest foreign-born population in Mexico? Americans, right? The numbers are greatly different, and they're very skewed. Some of them are actually ethnic Mexicans that have moved back, and then you also have the retirees that have gone there because it's cheaper and the weather's nicer, that sort of thing. And so I think, states understandably trying to control this, and certainly in the climate of post 9/11, they're trying to control it more. But I think it's part of the human spirit to want to move, to have that freedom of movement. And so, and in a global age, capital moves really freely, and people want to. It's not always so easily done, but it's happening in pretty significant numbers.
Other questions? No? Okay, I think that'll wrap up our first lecture for the Race and Ethnicity Conference. Thank you all for attending. Please remember to fill out those evaluations, and if you'd like, take one of those Why Geography Matters brochures and pass those evaluations to Professor Abed or Professor Light on both sides of the aisle. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.